The silence that speaks. It started in the stillness. Not the peaceful, picturesque kind of stillness you find in nature, but the kind that weighs heavy, where silence doesn't soothe you but suffocates. You don't realize how loud your soul is until everything around you grows quiet. That's what happened to me. I didn't plan for it, I didn't welcome it, but the silence came and it refused to leave. There are seasons in life where God feels near, His presence so tangible it's like oxygen. But then there are seasons where heaven feels like a locked door. I was in the latter. Prayers felt like echoes, bouncing off ceilings that never cracked open. I kept showing up, church, small group worship nights, but inside, I was numb. Worse, I felt forgotten. And that's where shame crept in. I thought something was wrong with me. Surely, real Christians don't feel like this. Surely, if I had more faith, I wouldn't feel so hollow. So I kept the silence a secret. I smiled on the outside and served others while I wrestled on the inside. It's a lonely thing, to feel lost in a crowd, to raise your hands in worship while your heart wonders if God has left the building. But grace is stubborn, and it doesn't need noise to move. What I didn't know then is that God wasn't absent in the silence. He was working in it. Like seeds buried in winter soil, something was happening beneath the surface. But in the moment, it just felt like waiting. Waiting is a strange kind of pain. It asks you to be still when everything in you wants to run, to trust when every voice screams doubt. I remember journaling one night and the page was blank for hours. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I didn't know how to say it. I didn't know how to tell God, I don't recognize myself anymore. There was a night I sat alone in my car, parked under a dim streetlight outside my apartment. The engine was off, the keys were in my lap, and I whispered, God, are you still there? I didn't hear a voice. No angel showed up. But in that silence, a thought settled into my chest. Even here. Even in the silence, even in the waiting, even in the middle of my uncertainty, He was still with me. That realization didn't fix everything overnight. It didn't fill the silence with noise, but it did something more powerful. It taught me how to listen. We don't often talk about how faith grows in quiet places. We love the mountaintop testimonies, the big miracles, the breakthroughs. But what about the slow, steady grace that shows up when you're too tired to keep pretending? That's the grace that met me. One morning, I opened my Bible to Psalm 13. How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? I felt seen, not condemned, not corrected, but seen. David, a man after God's heart, had felt the silence too. I wasn't alone, and if he could bring his ache to God, so could I. So I stopped filtering my prayers. I stopped trying to be the good Christian who always had it together. I started praying messy prayers, half-formed thoughts, whispered frustrations, tear-soaked questions. And to my surprise, that's when the silence began to shift. Not in volume, but in meaning. I realized the silence wasn't God punishing me. It was Him inviting me to let go, to sit with Him, to learn that His presence isn't always proven by fireworks. Sometimes it's proven by the simple fact that you're still breathing, still here, still seeking. I remember walking a trail behind my apartment complex one evening. The sun was setting, and everything was bathed in gold. I paused and looked up at the sky, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel invisible. I felt held, not by circumstances, not by clarity, but by the quiet confidence that even in the silence, I was seen. And that was enough to take the next step. When the stillness starts to sing, it didn't happen all at once. Nothing sacred ever does. But slowly, something began to shift in the quiet. It wasn't louder. It wasn't brighter. It was deeper. The stillness that once felt like a cage began to sound like a sanctuary. The silence that once echoed with fear began to hum with the presence of something holy, something familiar, something like grace. What changed wasn't my life on the outside. Bills still came. The same people called. My job was still draining. But what changed was the way I carried it all. The stillness that once threatened to crush me now seemed to carry me. And it started with the smallest things, like noticing. I noticed how the sunlight filtered through my kitchen window, touching the sink like a golden thread. I noticed how the sound of my neighbor's dog barking used to annoy me, but now made me laugh. I noticed how the coffee I used to gulp down just to survive the morning suddenly became something to savor. And through that noticing, I heard something. It wasn't a voice. It was something quieter. It was the awareness that grace was sitting with me in the mundane, that the silence was no longer empty, but occupied. I didn't need miracles. I needed presence. And presence was what I got. It showed up in a friend's text that simply said, "I thought about you today. Just wanted you to know I'm praying." It showed up in the worship song that played at just the right moment, the lyrics like balm to my dry soul. It showed up in the quiet conviction to open my Bible again, not out of guilt, but out of hope. And it showed up most powerfully in prayer. Not the polished kind, not the kind where I tried to say the right words or feel the right feelings. No, it was the kind of prayer where you just show up, where you sigh, where you cry, where you sit. And in that sitting, you realize you're not sitting alone. I began to write prayers that didn't ask for anything, just prayers of presence. God, I'm here. Are you here too? And slowly the answers came, not always in the form of solutions, but in a peace that passed understanding, in a stillness that began to sing. It was the song of trust, not the loud anthem of victory, but the quiet hum of faith that keeps going, that whispers, "Even if I don't see it, I believe you're still working." And the more I listened, the more I began to hear. I started noticing people differently. The cashier at the grocery store, the elderly woman sitting alone at church, the co-worker who always made jokes to hide his pain. Suddenly I wasn't just seeing them, I was hearing them, hearing their hearts, hearing their silence. And something in me wanted to respond. Not with solutions, but with presence. The same presence that had met me in my stillness, I wanted to offer to them. I wanted to become an echo of grace. So I started asking questions, real ones. Not how are you, but how is your heart? I started listening more than I talked. I started praying not just for people but with them, in parking lots, in coffee shops, even over text. Because the stillness had changed me. It had taught me that God doesn't always shout. Sometimes he whispers, and the whispers are powerful. They pierce deeper than the noise. They settle into the cracks of your soul and begin to rebuild. I remember sitting on my porch one rainy afternoon. I was reading Psalm 46:10, "Be still and know that I am God." I'd read it 100 times, but this time I heard it differently. The be still wasn't a command to stop moving. It was an invitation to stop striving. It wasn't about inactivity. It was about surrender. And in that surrender, the silence turned sacred. It became a space where I met God, not in performance, but in presence. Not in answers, but in assurance. Not in clarity, but in confidence that he was enough. I stopped demanding that God prove himself and started thanking him for being near. I stopped measuring my worth by my productivity and started receiving my identity from His love. And that changed everything. It didn't remove the problems, but it reframed them. Because when the stillness starts to sing, you realize that peace isn't the absence of trouble, it's the presence of someone greater than the trouble. And that song? It still plays. Listening with new ears. When God begins to soften the silence into a song, your ears don't just hear differently, your heart begins to listen with new intention. It was as if the static in my soul started to clear, not because the world got quieter, but because my inner world had begun to change. What once felt like divine absence now felt like an invitation to lean in closer. I started realizing how often I listened just to respond or to defend or to pretend I was fine. But now I was listening to discern, listening to receive. I wasn't trying to impress God or convince Him I was worthy of His time. I was beginning to believe He had been listening to me the whole time, even when I hadn't known how to speak. One morning, I found myself lingering in Matthew 11, verse 28 to 30. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. I must have read it 1,000 times before. But this time, the words came alive in a way they never had. I wasn't just weary from the world, I was weary from myself, from the expectations, the self-criticism, the inner voice that never stopped reminding me how I was falling short. And that's when it hit me. Grace listens. God's grace listens to the groans we can't put into words. It listens when we rant, when we mumble, when we cry without sound. It listens without fixing, without rushing. Grace doesn't need us to be polished to be present. It just needs us to be real. As I began listening with new ears, I started to catch glimpses of God in unexpected places. In the quiet courage of a single mom on the bus, holding her child and holding her peace. In the barista who remembered my name even when I couldn't remember to pray. In the stranger who let me merge into traffic with a kind wave that felt like a divine wink. It sounds small, doesn't it? But that's the thing about grace. It doesn't come as a spectacle. It comes in the size of mustard seeds. It comes in the hush, in the pause, in the whisper. And once you learn to listen for it, you start realizing it's been everywhere all along. I remember meeting someone who had gone through deep loss, the kind that makes most people avoid eye contact. But this person, they radiated a gentleness that wasn't fake, it was forged. And I asked them once, how did you survive it? They didn't quote scripture. They didn't offer cliches. They just said, I listened to my pain, to my heart, and somewhere in it all, I started to hear God. That stayed with me. Because for so long I thought faith was about turning down the volume of pain and cranking up the volume of praise. But now I realized sometimes faith is sitting in the middle of the static and saying, God, help me hear you here. Listening with new ears meant I stopped expecting thunder and started appreciating the subtle. I began finding sermons in conversations with children, in the rustling of leaves, in the breath between thoughts. The world hadn't changed, but my awareness had. There was one night I sat by a fire pit with friends. We weren't talking about anything spiritual. We were just laughing, telling stories, passing around marshmallows. And in a moment of stillness, I looked up at the stars and felt a lump in my throat. Not sadness, but fullness. The kind of quiet gratitude that says, God, I see you. That's when I understood something profound. Listening with new ears isn't just about hearing God's voice. It's about recognizing His tone in the people and places we often overlook. In the broken, in the boring, in the background. I think of Elijah in 1 Kings 19. He expected God in the wind, the earthquake, the fire, but God came in a whisper, a still, small voice. And maybe the point wasn't just that God came in the whisper, but that Elijah had to be quiet enough, desperate enough, open enough to hear it. That's what grace does. It tunes our hearts. It rewires our listening. It teaches us that presence isn't proven by volume. It's proven by the echo that settles in our soul long after the moment has passed. So now when the silence comes, I don't fear it. I don't fight it. I lean into it. I ask, Lord, what are you saying that I can only hear in this quiet? Sometimes the answer is clear. Sometimes it's not. But either way, I've learned that listening with new ears means I no longer need God to shout, because I've learned to hear Him even when He whispers. The sound of healing. Healing doesn't always announce itself with trumpets or grand gestures. More often than not, healing tiptoes into the soul, quiet and unnoticed, until one day you realize the weight has lifted. It might not be gone, but it's lighter. That's how grace works, not in shouts, but in whispers. Not in explosions, but in gentle tides that slowly reshape the shore. After weeks of struggling in the silence, something shifted. Not because I forced it, not because I tried harder, but because I finally surrendered to it. I stopped begging for the noise to come back and started listening for the sacredness in the quiet. I began to notice how the wind in the trees seemed to echo God's breath, how the morning light spilled like mercy across the floor, how my tears felt like prayers when I had no words left. One morning I sat by the window with a journal I hadn't touched in months. I didn't plan on writing anything profound, I just started. God, I'm still here. That's all I've got today. And to my surprise, I felt something stir. Not outside me, but within. A small flicker of warmth, grace. It wasn't dramatic, no visions, no booming voice, just peace. Still, calm, unshakable peace. It was the first time in a long while I didn't feel like I had to perform to be okay. That moment became a seed, and from it grew a new kind of healing. Healing that didn't erase the past, but reframed it. Healing that didn't rush the process, but honored every step. Healing that came not from answers, but from presence. I began taking walks without my headphones, allowing silence to speak. At first it was uncomfortable. My thoughts raced, but then I started to hear things I hadn't noticed before. Birds calling to one another, leaves crunching beneath my feet, my own breath. It felt like rediscovering my soul. People often assume healing looks like joy and energy returning overnight. But in reality, healing is found in the mundane. Doing the dishes, making your bed, texting a friend just to say, I'm thinking of you. Healing hides in repetition, in the slow rebuilding of a life. Psalm 147:3 says, He heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds. I used to picture this like a doctor fixing something broken. But now I see it more like an artist restoring a painting. Patiently, lovingly, with care. God isn't trying to erase our pain, He's bringing beauty from the cracks. During this season, I started therapy. It wasn't easy. Some sessions ended with more tears than breakthroughs. But I learned to name things, to sit in discomfort without letting it define me. I realized I had carried shame I didn't even recognize, not just for what happened, but for how long it took to feel whole again. But grace has no stopwatch. God wasn't impatient. He wasn't disappointed. In fact, I began to see how He celebrated every tiny win. Every time I chose honesty over hiding, every time I forgave instead of holding on, every time I simply got out of bed. Healing also came through others. A friend who dropped off soup without asking questions. A neighbor who waved every morning. A pastor who reminded me that God isn't afraid of our mess. These weren't big moments, but together they formed a melody, the sound of healing rising slowly in my life. I began volunteering at a local shelter. At first, it was just to get out of the house, but as I listened to the stories of others, I saw grace mirrored back at me. We were all broken in different ways, yet still beautiful, still valuable, still loved. One woman, Maria, shared how she had lost everything after fleeing abuse. Her story should have broken her, but her smile said otherwise. She told me, sometimes the worst days bring the clearest light. That stuck with me, because light had started breaking through my dark too. I revisited old prayers I had written in despair, and now, reading them back, I could see God's fingerprints, not in the resolutions, but in the resilience. Not in the miracles, but in the moments I chose to keep going. Eventually, I began singing again. Not on stage, not to impress, just humming around the house. It was as if my soul remembered a song I hadn't heard in years. The melody was simple, but it was mine. A song of survival, of surrender, of slow, sacred healing. This is what I know now. Healing is a love story between grace and perseverance. It's not linear, it's not clean, but it is holy. And as I look back, I no longer see a silence filled with absence. I see a silence filled with invitation. An invitation to be still, to be seen, and to be made new. That's the sound of healing. A new song in my soul. I used to think testimonies needed a climactic moment, a mountaintop revelation, a dramatic breakthrough, or an instant transformation. But I've learned that some of the most powerful stories of God's grace are not loud, they're not polished. They unfold slowly, in the shadows, through quiet acts of courage. That's what this season taught me. I didn't find God only in the miracle. I found Him in the mundane, in the moments that felt too small to matter. But they mattered to Him. There came a day when I woke up and didn't feel dread. That may not sound like much, but after months of struggling to even get out of bed, it was everything. I sat on the edge of the mattress, feet on the floor, breathing. And I realized I hadn't felt like that in a long time. Not because everything was fixed, but because something had shifted. Hope had returned, not in shouts, but in stillness. And that stillness sang a new song in my soul. I started writing again, not just journaling prayers, but crafting the words into something more. Poems, letters, blog posts. I didn't care who read them. I just needed to release what God was pouring into me. I began sharing small reflections online, and to my surprise, others resonated. People I didn't know messaged me saying, "I felt this," or "I thought I was the only one." That became my ministry, offering my pain as proof that God is still present. One morning, while sipping coffee on the porch, I began humming a tune. No lyrics, just melody. It felt familiar, but I couldn't place it. Then I realized it wasn't a song I'd heard before. It was a song rising from within. My soul had found a voice again. This song wasn't about perfection. It was about presence, about being here, about trusting that every scar carried a sound, every tear held a tone, and every step forward was part of a larger composition. Grace had composed a new rhythm in my life, one that danced with imperfection and delighted in persistence. I began meeting weekly with a group from church who had also walked through hard seasons. We didn't fix each other, we just sat in each other's stories, and slowly God wove harmony into our hurt. One of them said, "I think we're all walking songs. Some of us just forgot our lyrics." That stayed with me. because I had forgotten mine too. But now, they were returning. The new song didn't ignore what I'd been through. It included it. That was the grace of it. The suffering wasn't edited out, it was embraced. It gave the melody its depth, its richness, its meaning. I found joy again, not the kind that's loud or fleeting, but the kind that sits with you in silence, that anchors you when everything else feels uncertain. I laughed more, not because life was easier, but because I was lighter. I wasn't carrying the weight alone. There was one day, months later, when I stood in church during worship, and for the first time I sang out loud, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. My voice cracked, my eyes welled, but I didn't care. It wasn't about performance. It was about presence. I was there, alive, redeemed, singing. Psalm 43 says he put a new song in my mouth, a hymn of praise to our God. Many will see and fear the Lord and put their trust in him. That verse became my anthem, because my new song wasn't just for me. It was for others who still sat in silence, wondering if healing would ever come. And so to you who are still waiting for the music to return, let me say this: your silence is not empty. God is composing something in the quiet. It may not sound like much now, but one day it will rise. A song, your song, one that testifies not to your strength, but to his grace. And if you ever feel like no one hears you, remember this: God does. Always. He sings over you. Zephaniah 3:10. He delights in you. He doesn't wait for you to get it all together. He meets you where you are and brings music from your mess. So don't rush the silence. Don't despise the stillness. There's a song forming in you, a song only you can sing. And when it comes, let it rise. Let it fill the space that once held sorrow. Let it declare, grace found me here. And if this journey has spoken to you in any way, if you've seen yourself in these words, please share this video. Comment with your own testimony or encouragement. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of hope and healing. Let's keep singing together. Let's be reminders to the world that grace still writes beautiful songs in broken places.